Peter has been a professor in the biology department at the University of Puget Sound for more than 15 years. He also directs the environmental and policymaking program. Peter's a conservation biologist and a passionate birder. Thanks to a fascinating interview with Peter that I had an opportunity to listen to on Ed Pullen's Bird Banter, I learned that Peter was not a birder from birth. Rather, a mentor at Bowdoin College gets the credit for introducing him to tube noses, that is the alcids that nest in burrows and spend their lives at sea. And this introduction turned out to be kind of life-determining. These species became his professional passion and, in his words, his personal weakness. For his PhD, he conducted research in Antarctica on tube noses for 3 years. And after finishing his degree, he decided that conservation biology was where he really wanted to turn his attention. And after looking around, he became aware of 6 tube noses that nest on islands in the Juan Fernandez Islands, which are west of Chile. And he has been involved in research and conservation work there on those species for several decades. And what I found especially impressive is how Peter has gotten to know and love the local community and how he's involved them in learning more about and protecting these and other species. Here in Washington, Peter's work has focused on the 11 tube noses that live in the Salish Sea and primarily out on Washington's outer coast. And the goal of his work has been to figure out how these populations are doing, to identify problems and to try to address them. And there's much more to say about Peter, but I'll stop here and turn the podium over to Peter. Thank you.
Well, Wayne pulls up my presentation. Thank you for the very gracious introduction. Which was really awkward. Are folks comfortable with my mask off if I just present with my mask off? Okay. I teach with a mask, and I'm happy to do it, but I just wanted to check. It's just a little bit easier to speak without it. So thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here and to be the first in-person speaker as you begin to, yes, we begin to reestablish connections and our basic humanity. And so what I'd like to do tonight is speak a little bit about seabirds in our region, including both the Salish Sea and the outer coast of Washington, and with a particular focus on some collaborative work that several of my colleagues and I have been doing in this area. So as Vicky mentioned, my introduction to seabirds began quite a while ago in college, and it has my passion for them has only deepened over the years. My wife calls it an unhealthy obsession, which I take as a compliment. But I moved up to Washington 18 years ago now. But prior to that, and even now to this day, a lot of my seabird related conservation work has focused, as Vicky mentioned, on islands in Chile, including pink-footed shearwater. Many of you may have seen pink-footed shearwaters off the coast of Washington. It's a species that is of global conservation concern. And when you think about the scale of the movement, you know, even just the basic natural history and what it requires for these birds to move from their breeding colonies in Chile up into the Pacific Northwest every single year between breeding seasons, that alone is a phenomenal thing to contemplate. No, it's totally fine. And as part of the long-term conservation work that we've been engaged in Chile, and particularly on the Juan Fernandez Islands and on Isla Mocha, we're working on a variety of threatened and endangered species, both seabirds and terrestrial birds, including 2 critically endangered single island endemic species, the Juan Fernandez firecrown, stunning hummingbird, endemic to a single island in the world, and the Masafuera rayadito, which is a single island endemic that's also critically endangered. So I love talking about those things. So maybe someday you can have me back and I can talk about that. But for tonight, I'm focused, on matters much closer to home for all of us. And When I moved up here, I had an opportunity to begin to work on seabirds, and I really didn't have a sense of where the opportunities were yet. So I started working out on Tatoosh Island with permission of the Makah Nation with Julia Parrish and Scott Pearson, a couple of colleagues. And so this was my entree into seabirds of the Pacific Northwest, or certainly in Washington. So I worked on that island for several years, and our initial work there built out to look more broadly at seabird conservation opportunities and needs throughout Washington state waters. And for tonight's talk, although I'm not going to focus exclusively on these three species, but I'm going to focus most heavily on these three, two of which are of conservation concern: the tufted puffin and marbled murrelet, and then rhinoceros auklets, which are kind of an interesting counterpoint to tufted puffins, because rhinoceros auklets are puffins. Despite the common name, they seem to be doing just fine in the same places with similar diet, and I'll get to this narrative a little bit later, as tufted puffins. So a species in dramatic decline that's really of great concern throughout their their range in the lower 48, and a sister species that, using the same waters, same breeding islands, is managing just fine. So in terms of where I want to go tonight, I just want to make a few comments about the islands of the outer coast and Salish Sea, and then transition into talking a little bit about status of seabirds on the outer coast and Salish Sea, and then drill down and really focus on a few of our focal species and islands, and that will lead us into talking about threats that are confronting those species, but also more broadly when we look at the seabird community in our waters. And then looking forward, so where are the opportunities? What can we do knowing what we know now? So I wanted to let you know that we undertake this work at great risk to our health and safety. We regularly transition between the lands of vampires and werewolves out on the outer coast. Those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, this is the Twilight phenomenon that kind of was a boom and bust for a number of years out on the coast. It was a kind of a young adult series of novels that was set in Forks. And so this is still on your way out to La Push. For those of you that have not gone out to La Push, this sign is still prominently featured prior to reaching La Push. So just to let you know, the risks we undertake to undertake this work. So on the outer coast of Washington, we have dozens and dozens of islands. They're small, they're rugged, they're hard to access. And most of them, thankfully, are protected at the federal level as part of an extensive national wildlife refuge system. Many of you may have had the chance to do pelagics out in this area, or just recreationally go out fishing or bird watching. It's a stunning part of the world. And these islands house breeding habitat for seabirds. Closer to home. Okay, this is locked up. Let's see if I can just manually get it. There we go. Okay, so closer to home, we've got Protection Island, which is situated between Port Townsend and Squim, which is another federally protected island. It's actually a mix. Part of the island is state-owned land, the Zeller-Schultz Wildlife Refuge or Seabird Refuge, and the rest is federal refuge. So we have one of the fortunate circumstances that we find ourselves in Washington state is that virtually all of the significant seabird islands in Washington waters are federally protected. So I recognize that not everybody spends as much time of their conscious hours thinking about seabirds as I do, which is probably healthy. But I wanted to just take a moment or two to talk a little bit about the natural history of seabirds, to give you a. Oh, was that? Yes, no, thank you. I missed doing that. Thank you, Elaine. So just to end, for those of you that are familiar with it, just to give us a little bit of a refresher. And The reason for doing this here is not just to communicate some aspects that are remarkable about seabirds, but also because they have important conservation. These natural history characteristics have important conservation implications. So when we talk about seabirds, they're actually a very eclectic, diverse group of birds. They're from multiple orders of birds, and they range from inshore. So kind of the iconic species around here are pigeon guillemots, to species that are highly pelagic, species that you need to do a Westport pelagic or something like that to see. They only come in sight of land when they're coming to and from breeding colonies. And aside from that, they spend the rest of their lives at sea. Let's see, is that down here? They are characterized by high adult survival. So they tend to be very long-lived, from 20 years up to 50, 60 plus years. They're banded albatrosses that are known to be at least 70 years old, and still coming back to breed most years at the breeding colonies. This is an important consideration when we think about, again, how we consider conservation for species that have these life history characteristics. Associated with that high adult survival is what we call deferred sexual maturity. So they take a number of years to begin to breed. And the assumption is that this is derived largely from the challenges of making a living at sea. It's not an easy life out there to find enough food, not just for yourself, but to be skillful and efficient enough at that you can accrue the additional costs and demands of provisioning, not just yourself, but also an offspring. So it takes years to basically develop that level of expertise. They also have a low reproductive rate. So 1 to 3 eggs per year is common. And for many species, they can't replace lost eggs. So in the case of the most extreme case of this is with the tube noses, so the Procelariiforms. They lay 1 egg a year at most. Some species, if they're successful, lay in alternate years. And if that egg is lost, that's the end of their breeding season. The female has invested so much in that egg that she can't actually provision a second egg in that year. So when you think about all of those, we set up a situation in which populations are very vulnerable to disturbances, especially if those disturbances have consequences for adult survival. If you impact adult survival negatively, it affects recruitment. It affects the size of the breeding population. And if they're already breeding at a very, very low rate, even in the best of years, you set up a situation in which populations, even under ideal conditions, are not going to be able to recover quickly. They are primarily migratory. And that migration, the scale of that migration varies massively. So we have local migration, so species that may move within the Salish Sea, but are largely resident in Washington waters throughout the year, to species that are moving across entire ocean basins, covering tens of thousands of kilometers between breeding seasons. So all of this really tells a story of complex life histories. These species cover vast spatial scales. They are dependent on protected, isolated breeding colonies for the most part. They live a long time. They reproduce very slowly. All of this ties together into a story that sets us up to better understand what does all of this mean for conservation of seabirds. So, what do we know about seabirds in Washington? In the Salish Sea, there are about 70 to 75 species that are highly dependent either seasonally on Salish Sea waters or year-round. So those can be resident species or species that come in seasonally. Most of those seasonal species are what we recognize as kind of counterintuitive for our latitude, in that they come and they winter here. So we have the greatest diversity of marine birds during the fall, winter, and spring months. And during the summer months, again, as many of you are aware, we have very low species diversity. High biomass, a lot of birds, but very few species. On the outer coast, a lot of the diversity that we see out there is seasonal. So species that are migrating into the system for the summer months, when productivity is maximal, conditions are long days, ideal conditions to basically improve your body condition, escaping the challenges of winter conditions in the southern hemisphere. And we currently have two species that are both state listed, and one of which is federally listed. The other one is a candidate for listing. So marbled murrelets are state listed and federally listed. Tufted puffins are state listed, and they are a candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Excuse me. So if we look at kind of the breakdown by family of species diversity, their conservation status, and then which those species are, that's what I've represented in this table here. So the left column are the five species, the five family groups: storm petrels, petrels and shearwaters, alcids, cormorants, and gulls. The number of species, and I'll get into some of those question marks in a moment, because they're indicative of kind of the state of our knowledge of the seabird community in our waters. That third column, the VU, are endangered. So the orange represents species that are federally or state listed and or state listed as vulnerable or endangered. And then the four-letter acronyms by species, if you're interested in the rightmost column. So storm petrels, we have two species. Officially, Leach's storm petrels are not classified as vulnerable. Biologically, we consider them to be vulnerable. We just haven't gotten the formal listing status approved. Fork-tailed storm petrels seem to be doing a little bit better in our waters. Petrels and shearwaters, the one question mark, anybody have a guess what that species might be? Manx shearwaters, yes. So we consistently see small numbers of Manx shearwaters on the outer coast, and there's no direct evidence of them breeding, but we suspect that there may be a small breeding population. The problem is Manx shearwaters, which are their known breeding distribution is the North Atlantic, but they migrate down into the South Atlantic during their wintering period. And so, what we assume happened is Manx shearwaters went down into the South Atlantic, they got blown around the Cape, and then some directionally challenged ones didn't figure out that they were on the wrong side of the Americas and happily went north and realized, wait, the coast is on the wrong side. Where are we? But we see them every year. So they may well be breeding in small numbers. With the alcids, we have 6 confirmed species that breed in Washington, 2 of which, both the tufted puffin and the marbled murrelet, are a species of conservation concern. Those have rhinoceros auklets, pigeon guillemots, Cassin's auklets, and common murres. We now, and this is a little bit of foreshadowing of something I'll mention in more detail in a moment, but we now think we've got pretty good evidence that ancient murrelets are actually breeding on the outer coast, which was tentatively described 100 years ago with a single egg. And since then, there's been no evidence, indirect or direct. Cormorants, we have 3 species, none of which are of conservation concern. Gulls and terns, you all know this, it's a mess. Who knows how many species we have? I confidently say we've got Caspian terns, the gulls, good luck. But we do have 8 species of concern, either at the Washington or federal level. And species of concern is an informal category. It means that they're not formally listed by the state or the federal government. So we do have, there's a lot of work to be done here. And one of the challenges is that for many species, and not just the ones here, if we also include diving ducks and loons and grebes, the status and population trends are actually pretty poorly known for many of those species, which for me, when I arrived here, was actually surprising, given that, we do have government, state and federal agencies, we've got, universities, we've got nonprofits, But it's a testament to just how complicated it is to actually generate these data, especially on the outer coast. So it does provide opportunities, exciting opportunities, but when we're trying to understand really where conservation priorities are, it presents a pretty formidable challenge. So we've got tufted puffins. Again, Washington listed as endangered. They're a federal candidate. We have both a status report that my colleagues and I generated 7 years ago now, and that led to the listing of the species. And more recently, a couple of years ago, we published the recovery plan and periodic status review for the species at the state level. Rhinoceros auklets, they're a species of least concern. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they seem to be thriving as far as our data indicate. Leach's storm petrels. I wish I had taken this picture, but I can't claim credit for it. They're actually the species that got me started on seabirds, whenever that was, 38, 37 years ago. And I continue to have a real weak spot for them. They're wonderful species, and they do seem to be declining in Washington waters with the little data that we do have. Cassin's auklets are classified as near threatened currently. And again, we don't have great data, but the little data that exists suggests that they've also been declining. And a picture of Manx shearwaters here in a flock of sooty shearwaters. This was off just north. A lot of the times where we see these are off the Hoh River. So north of Destruction Island, so between La Push and Destruction Island, which is an area we transit regularly to get out to do field work on Destruction Island. But there's a couple of Manxes sitting in there amongst sooties. And again, we don't see this every trip, but we see it consistently enough. And other boat-based surveys for seabirds also see them in small numbers. The challenge is, they could be hundreds of, because of their range, they could be hundreds of miles from their breeding colony. These birds, if they're breeding, could conceivably be breeding on the Scott Islands off the northern tip of Vancouver Island, and making the trip down to Washington waters during incubation and chick rearing. So it's daunting. They're nocturnal, burrow nesting seabirds. And if they are breeding, we're talking about a small population. So it's a challenge to even assess whether or not they, with any degree of confidence, if and where they might be breeding. Ancient murrelets, another species of least concern, and I'm going to just use that as a transition because ancient murrelets are also a challenging species. They breed on small islands typically. They are nocturnal on the colonies. And so there's a lot of logistical challenges. And especially if we're talking about small breeding population, or the possibility of small breeding populations. And we're looking at 40 or 50 potential islands on which they could be breeding. So here's another island, Jagged Island, that we're starting to do a little bit of work on. It's challenging to land on. It's difficult to work on. It's pretty steep, very friable, fragile slopes. And so with a lot of these islands, access is an issue, and wanting to be really careful and minimize any sort of impact is an issue. So they're not really amenable to doing intensive field work on them. So we're using some pretty neat technology that we haven't developed, but that is being leveraged to in a variety of ways to sample places that are difficult to access. So these are essentially glorified recorders. They're programmable, they're bioacoustic, and they allow you to do bioacoustic or biological acoustic monitoring. And you set them out there, you program them for when you want them to sample, for how long, and then you get potentially months and months of data of ambient sounds. And so you can use these recording units to record the seabird community when you're not there. And then you come back, retrieve the units. You've done nothing to really disturb the island in any way. And then you have a much better sense of the species that are on these islands. And again, for islands like Jagged, it's not appropriate to be, you can't camp on it. You don't want to be spending a lot of time on it because you're going to be destroying seabird habitat. So this is it's a way to allow us to access those communities of seabirds without causing any damage. So coming back to ancient murrelets, we've been deploying these ARUs, or automated recording units, on a number of islands that we suspected might be promising habitat for a variety of species, including ancient murrelets. So in this figure, the smaller inset shows the area of the outer coast. So between La Push and Nia Bay, and there's an island group called the Bedeltas. And this is a place where we've had recording units for a few years, particularly targeting ancient murrelets. And what we get out of this is, I mean, you can listen to the recordings, but now there are these algorithms that you can train. And I'm not clever enough to do this. We collaborate with experts in this, but using artificial intelligence, you can create these algorithms that recognize species-specific vocalizations. So instead of you listening, to a mind-numbing 400 hours of recordings of, waves crashing and occasional birds calling, you can get the computers to do it. And they generate these sorts of frequency histograms. This is one way to visualize the data. The details of the pattern aren't important, but what I want to highlight is that rectangle there, because that is an ancient murrelet vocalization, which stands out. It's distinct from the rest of the acoustic signatures around it. And we've since had multiple confirmations of this. So that means that these are ancient murrelets that are on the island and vocalizing. And so the next step then is to start to do some more direct surveys on those islands. But it's a way for us to kind of put minimal effort in, gain a lot of insight into what's likely there, and that then informs our priority setting in terms of conservation work and population monitoring. So another island that we work on is Alexander Island. This is south of La Push. It's between La Push and Destruction Island. And this is another island that's hard to access. And so it's a place where we have used a combination of trail cameras. So these are motion sensitive cameras that will work during daylight, and they've got infrared capacity, and coupling that with these ARUs, these bioacoustic recording units. So this is all work that's done collaboratively with a number of colleagues. Just wanted to mention Scott Pearson on the far left. He's a senior research scientist with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I regularly have undergraduate research students do aspects of the research with me and do senior thesis work. So that's a student from a couple of years ago, Lily Patton. In the middle is Tom Good from NOAA, Northwest Fisheries Science Center, right here in Seattle. And then in the back right is Chad Norris, who's a biologist and boat captain for DFW. So he worked with Scott. And Sue Thomas, who's the refuge biologist, who's tasked with the small mandate of keeping track of what's going on 50 plus islands within the National Wildlife Refuge System. Great colleagues. It's a joy to work with them. And I really appreciate them, not just as scientists, but as really dedicated folks advancing conservation in our area. So this is just a photo of the quality of the habitat on these islands where there are no mammals. So most of these islands are mammal-free, and you get these dense stands of perennial grasses, bunch grasses and beach grasses. And embedded within that is this matrix of burrows. So in this photo, all of those dark shadows are burrow entrances, incredible densities. So in this, like just on this little slope, there are likely tufted puffins, there are rhinoceros auklets, Cassin's auklets, and 2 species of storm petrels. All on just in probably within that photo. And then if you scale it out and you look a little bit more broadly, you see there's a lot of habitat for these birds, and in many parts of this, it's multiple burrows per burrow entrances per square meter. And again, just to give you a sense of scale, right on that little ridge line, you can see one of our colleagues sitting there. On the horizon, you can see Destruction Island. That's the gray sliver right on the horizon line. Just again, to situate you a little bit more. But these islands are all inshore. So just off to the left there is the mainland of Washington State. We also work on Destruction Island, which is, off of Ruby Beach, so a bit south of Alexander. And we've been working on this island pretty intensively since 2008. The project began with this species, rhinoceros auklets, and we undertook a comparative study of rhinoceros auklets on Tatoosh Island, Destruction Island, and then Protection Island. So 3 different populations in 3 different marine systems. But as the situation for tufted puffins became increasingly clear, we've added tufted puffins to the focal work on the island. But it's a remarkable island for seabirds. It's got a nice population of Brandt's cormorants, hundreds and hundreds. I mean, nobody has any idea how many pigeon guillemots are breeding on the island. And then more locally, we've got Protection Island. So we kind of work on yin and yang. We work on Destruction Island and we work on Protection Island, sometimes within a few days of each other. So Protection Island, as I mentioned before, is also federally protected, except for the southern part, which is state land. And Smith Island, so north of Protection Island, kind of off the northwest side of Whidbey, or the very south end of the San Juans, which is also federally protected under National Wildlife Refuge. So that was just to kind of situate you a little bit in terms of some of the species and their status and some of the islands that we've been working on. And now I'm going to shift more towards species-specific comments and take a couple of minutes to talk about tufted puffins. So tufted puffins are a species that are arguably, they are the most threatened species in Washington State and quite possibly in the entire California current, meaning the waters of California, Oregon, and Washington. Work that Scott and I have done to look at historical records of colonies and then boat-based surveys more recently have shown a really depressing pattern. So in the early 1900s, our best estimate based on these historical records is that we had 43 colonies, which means separate islands. So within Washington waters, we had 43 islands that had puffin colonies, some of which would have had only a few or a handful of tufted puffins. It declined, but not precipitously up until the late 70s, early 80s. So we'd lost some colonies. They were mainly small colonies with just a few birds, breeding birds. But if you look then, and that was over nearly a century. But if you look then on the subsequent 30 or so years, you see a really worrying decline. So this is not just numbers of birds. This is entire colonies that are no longer active. So we have less than half of the active colonies now than we did 100 years ago. And if we look at colony sizes, so numbers of individuals, prior to 1978, we had 9 colonies that were estimated to have at least 1,000 individuals associated with them, 2 of which were thought to best estimates. These were crude estimates, but even if you allow for some sloppiness in the estimates, likely had at least 2 of which had at least 10,000 individuals associated with those islands. Currently, we don't have a single island anywhere near even 1,000 birds. And we've only got 3 that we estimate to have 100 to 200 birds associated with it. So it's not just that we're losing colonies, we're also losing numbers. So it's not a case of birds moving, it's a case of losing birds from the population. And a way to visualize this is from the 2015 status review. The upper set of panels, the A, B, and C, the upper 3, are the outer coast. So it's the same map over those 3 time periods. Late 1800s to middle 1970s is that left-hand panel A, 1978 to 1984, the middle panel, and then the rightmost panel is the most recent time period from which we've done these boat-based surveys. The dots represent the locations of colonies, and also the size of the colonies. So if you look across there, you can see that the purple colonies go away. The orange colonies, which represent the largest colonies, they disappear. And then just the absolute number of dots is decreasing. The bottom right, the bottom panel, the D, E, and F, that's the San Juans and the same time periods. And what you can see is a systematic disappearance of tufted puffins from the San Juans. The only remaining populations that we have here in the Salish Sea today are Protection Island and Smith Island. All the others are gone. But recognize too that those red dots, those are the smallest colony size classes. So we're talking about colonies that historically, even at their peak, were pretty small. But I don't know how many of you cruise through the San Juans these days, but you don't even see a tufted puffin. They're just not there. So if we look at some quantitative estimates, and these are really crude because historically we just don't have very good data. But the best data we have suggests that we're looking at a rate of decline that's 8 or 9% annually. You don't need to be a mathematical modeler to project out that it doesn't take long for a long-lived, slow reproducing population that's declining at 9% to disappear. And to give some numbers kind of on the total population, and again, take these with more than a grain of salt, probably an entire salt shaker. But again, even if we're off by 1,000 or 2 birds, early 1900s, our best estimate based on what we can find in the literature is probably about 25,000 birds on the outer coast. By the mid-1970s, late 70s, early 80s, it had dropped, but by about 10% or so, 10, 15%. But it's in that most recent period, the most recent 30 or so years, where we've lost a really scary proportion of the population. And what we're seeing here in Washington is not unique to Washington. It's actually being mirrored throughout the California current system. So in Oregon, they've documented 90+% declines in breeding tufted puffins since 1988. California's lost over 90% of their population in the last century. So what's affecting them here is affecting them throughout this, what we call the California current system. They're even starting to see evidence of declines as far north as Triangle Island, which is north of the north tip of Vancouver Island. So we're trying to do, and one of the things that was surprising to me is such an iconic, charismatic species as a puffin, you'd assume that they're studied to death. Tufted puffins have not actually been well studied outside of Alaska. There's been a lot more work done up there. But down here in the lower 48, Washington, California, and Oregon, small numbers, hard to access. They just have not been well studied. And so a challenge is trying to understand what are the drivers. We can document these things, but as a conservation biologist, the idea isn't to just document, decline. It's to say, how do we stabilize this and hopefully reverse it? But we have so little data on how the population is doing, what factors might be driving it, what's their breeding ecology relative to what we see in other better studied places. So we do things like look at burrow visitation rates and breeding success. This is a tufted puffin leaving a breeding burrow after provisioning a chick. We do things like collect colony activity patterns so we can track these numbers over time to generate complementary estimates of population sizes associated with breeding colonies. And this is about as many puffins as you see on a colony in Washington these days at any one time. This up in Alaska, you're talking about orders of magnitude, larger sample size or population sizes. We're also trying to really understand better the role of diet. So, not surprisingly, diet is implicated as a potential driver of population declines, but there were no published data on tufted puffin diet before we started working on it about 10 years ago. So we use different techniques. The really quick take home is that It looks like they're eating similar things as they did historically, but what we don't know is the relative abundance of those prey items. So they might be eating the same things, but if they're less abundant and or less available, that's a problem, even if everything is still there. So we do photo documentation like this, where we can actually identify the species, the prey in the bill. We can also measure size and make inferences about kind of the quality of the diet using photographic techniques. So in the Salish Sea, again, coming back to the 2 remnant islands, this is what we have left. It's pretty scary when you can actually count the precise number of breeding pairs. That's not something you want. You want to be able to say, oh, there's too many, we're estimating it at. But the last 2 years, there have been 24 and 25 breeding pairs on Smith Island. Protection Island, there's so few of them that it takes hours and hours to even find an active burrow. And we strongly suspect there's less than 5. It may be as few as 3 breeding pairs left. And for those of you that have been going out to Protection Island for years, and I don't know if any of you have, I'd be interested to hear if you have any perspectives on the numbers of birds you see offshore of the island. In the 15 years we've been working there, we've seen a decline in just the numbers of birds on the water. They were never great, even 15 years ago, you'd see a handful of birds, but now we're seeing in most places nothing, and even in the most consistent spots, no more than a couple of birds at a time. So what we're kind of confronted with, because we've been able to look at these 2 species, tufted puffins, which are not faring well, rhinoceros auklets, which are doing great, seemingly, we can start to tease out what might be some of the factors that are causing the declines, because again, they co-occur, they breed on many of the same islands. They're both deep diving seabirds for whom they share a significant amount of dietary overlap. So one's failing, one's thriving. So we have very strong contrasting patterns between the 2 of them. We have, at least in the Salish Sea, the evidence that we have suggests that rhinoceros auklets have actually increased since the 1970s, and pretty significantly, whereas we're seeing ongoing declines with tufted puffins. On the outer coast, puffins have been declining. Rhinoceros auklets seem to be a bit more stable. They don't seem to, if they have increased, it's a lot subtler than in the Salish Sea. Reproductive success, again, in the Salish Sea, rhinoceros auklets are actually doing better now than they were in the 1970s, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think about all of the impacts these cumulative impacts that we have in the Salish Sea that are only compounding themselves over time. Tufted puffins, again, declining. Diet, we actually have some really good diet data from the 1970s. All of those historical data from the 70s for rhinoceros auklets are courtesy of Ulrich Wilson and Laura Leshner, who did their graduate work with Dave Manuel at UW here. And they give us some great comparative data. So what we do know is that diet doesn't seem to have changed meaningfully either on the outer coast or in the Salish Sea for rhinoceros auklets. Unfortunately, we don't have the same sort of historical data for tufted puffins. So we're using some indirect measures, including stable isotopes, to kind of infer trophic level or where the birds are feeding in the food web. And if folks are interested, I can provide more details about that work, in comments or in questions later. So the last little section that I want to talk about is marbled murrelets in the South Sound. And this is something that kind of came up serendipitously. Like you, I'm also just a naturalist. I love being out there. I love being on the water. And I'm a really keen sea kayaker. And for several years, just paddling around in the general Tacoma area, during the summer months, I was noticing spots where it just seemed like every time I paddled through these areas, I was seeing small numbers of marbled murrelets in breeding plumage. And so I thought, well, let's look at this a little bit more substantively and systematically. So I I've had several research students over the last few breeding seasons, the last couple of summers, begin to actually look at this in a more rigorous way. And so we've been doing surveys, boat-based and shore-based surveys in these areas that I was kind of tentatively calling hotspots. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because I wanted to just take a moment to celebrate the gloriously absurd life history of marbled murrelets. Again, many of you may be aware of this, but for those of you that aren't, it's pretty spectacular. So marbled murrelets, like other alcids, are a diving largely piscivorous or fish-feeding wing-propelled seabird. But unlike other alcids, they do this crazy thing when breeding. So most self-respecting seabirds look for, a nice island offshore, or maybe a protected headland, somewhere pretty inaccessible, but coastal, immediate access to the water. For some perverse reasons, that didn't work for marbled murrelets, and they tend to breed well inland, at least in our region, in old growth and mature second growth forest, way up in the canopy of coniferous trees. So that right-hand part of this lovely illustration by Laurel Mundy shows birds flying in with fish. The egg is laid on a large branch. There's no real nest. The chick grows up on the branch, never leaves the branch until it fledges. And they do all of this under cover of darkness. So not only are they flying sometimes tens of miles inland into old growth forest, but they're doing this at 40 to 50 miles an hour at night to avoid predators. Remarkable when you think about just how that has survived and it's served them well historically. Until we started to remove their critical breeding habitat. So they have declined throughout, again, the California current system, California, Oregon, and Washington up into British Columbia. They're federally listed both in Canada and the US. So here's a map of Tacoma. Point Defiance is a little green thumb there. Commencement Bay in the center. And you see those little ellipses. Those are areas that I had identified just from kayaking around, areas where I was seeing these birds. And so we've done systematic surveys over the last few years and actually determined that the area off Browns Point Lighthouse, which is, you see where Dash Point is up towards the top, it's that next point down at the lower part of that upper right ellipse is Browns Point Lighthouse. That is used consistently by rhinoceros auklets. Rhinoceros auklets are there sometimes too. Marbled murrelets throughout the breeding season. And these are birds that are in breeding plumage. See them day in, day out, not large numbers, but sometimes up to 10 or 12 birds at a time. And that suggests, and this has been over a few seasons now, smaller numbers of birds off Point Fosdick, which is just south of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, off Gig Harbor, down by Chambers Bay, to a lesser degree. But birds are there feeding throughout the breeding season, and then they disappear. So behavior that aligns really well with breeding birds. And we have seen fledglings in this area as well. Especially this summer, we saw a handful of fledglings. So it really strongly suggests that they're breeding in the South Sound. Still, historically, there's no doubt they would have been. And probably quite abundantly, but we have no contemporary records of them breeding in the South Sound in our region. So it does open up the possibility that there's a remnant population of this federally threatened and state listed bird just down around Tacoma or maybe Olympia. The challenge again is these are birds that are going into some patch of old growth or mature second growth forest. But when you think about where that potentially is, and recognizing that they could go into the edge of Mount Rainier, like in theory, they could fly up the Puyallup River drainage and hit good quality forest around Federation Forest, or even closer to Mount Rainier. And they're doing this at night at high speeds. Like, how are we going to find where if they're even breeding, we're this handful of birds are still breeding in our region. But exciting when you think about a species using such an urbanized landscape, and it does point to the resiliency of a lot of these birds, but also their vulnerability. So there's Browns Point Lighthouse, beautifully restored recently. Points Northeast Historical Society led that restoration effort. If you haven't been out to that, it's a lovely little park. It's a great spot to bird, especially for inshore marine birds. And during the summer months, if you want an easy play, pretty much a guaranteed place to find marbled murrelets, come down there in the morning from early May through late July, and you're almost guaranteed to see them. Sometimes as close as 30 or 40 meters from shore. So in terms of threats to seabirds, the threats that I'm going to share here are, although they are relevant to seabirds in Washington, they're not unique to seabirds in Washington. So these are threats that confront seabirds globally to greater or lesser degrees. And not all of these threats are relevant to all seabirds in our waters. But one is related to prey. So prey availability. You know, we have altered inshore marine systems. We have fished. We have done a variety of things to these systems that has altered the balance of marine food webs. And that changes the availability and abundance of prey species like forage fish, like these guys here. Recovery of avian predators. And this is a really interesting one because we celebrate the recovery of bald eagles, right? You know, justifiably. For how many of you do you like see a bald eagle today and you're like, oh my gosh, it's a bald eagle? Like they're almost a daily occurrence for us. 50 years ago, it would have been remarkable to see a bald eagle in this area. So they've recovered spectacularly well. Peregrine falcons, similar sort of story. They've recovered stunningly well. But they're recovering into a system that is very different than the system they largely disappeared from 50, 60, 70 years ago. And they are shifting what they prey on. So bald eagles are really flexible predators. Not as many salmon in the system, not as many forage fish. Well, I'll eat gulls. I'll eat, you know, tufted puffins. I'll harass inshore marine birds. So what happens when you get a recovery of species that are native to the system, but they're now playing a role that's a little bit different because the system is different? So, you know, it's basically a question of what happens when your endangered species eats my endangered species. Contaminants and pollution, that's both chronic and acute. You know, we obviously have long-term issues with these chronic contaminants that are persistent in our waters and in our inshore subsurface areas. And then we also have acute things like this, you know, the risk of oil spills and things like that. Fisheries bycatch, especially with salmon gillnet fisheries. This we know hammered a lot of diving birds in our waters for a number of decades before mitigation measures were put in place. So there are technological fixes to this to really drop the rates of bycatch, but it's not to zero. And so it is an issue for some diving birds even today. Shoreline armoring, and this is a little less obvious in that it's an indirect effect. But so much of our region, as you know, is dependent on influx of sediments from rivers, from creeks, from feeder bluffs, where we have these erosive bluffs that regularly slough off sediment with nutrients and so forth into the inshore waters. And that is the basis for the rich inshore communities that we have, including eelgrass and kelp and so forth. Those are nurseries for a lot of the prey base that then magnifies up the food chain. When we interrupt the introduction of those sediments and those nutrients by armoring shorelines, we're basically depriving those inshore areas of vital nutrients. And over time, that has consequences for kind of the base of the food chain, which then again amplifies up. Introduced species. So in this case, it's a stare down for a very displeased tufted puffin and an introduced European rabbit out on Destruction Island. Both plant and animal species can be problematic for seabirds. Predators, competitors, plants that alter their breeding habitat, change the structure of plant communities on islands. Disturbances, thankfully on the breeding colonies, they're really low because again, most of these islands are locked up. They're federally protected. There's no public access to them, which is unfortunate in some respects, but it does help secure these really vulnerable populations at this time. At sea, boat traffic and so forth can be a problem. Harmful algal blooms, which are increasing in frequency as we see the effects of a warming ocean and climate change. So that leads us to climate change, and then an associated factor is ocean acidification. So seabirds face a pretty daunting suite of realized and potential threats, depending on the particular species and their life histories. I want to talk really quickly about forage fish, because although the focus tonight is really on seabirds, seabirds can only succeed if they have food, which is hardly a startling revelation. But so much of the systems, the marine systems that we live around, that bound us in the Salish Sea and the outer coast are driven by forage fish. So if we look at the figure on the upper left, I love this. It's a great figure by the Pew Environment Group. You can see plankton down at the bottom. Energy flow is moving from the bottom towards the top of the image. So plankton at the bottom, then you see this bottleneck where it says forage fish. Almost everything that we look at upper trophic levels or higher in the food web, upper trophic level predators is the term for them, whether those are mature salmon, marine mammals, seabirds, they depend on what's going on at that forage fish level of a food web. So when that is reduced, it has consequences for everything above it, including seabirds. And this figure here, I think is, and I hope you can see the bold, I'll talk you through it. This is a very simplified food web. I know there's a bunch of arrows, but you should see the more complex food webs for our waters. They're eye-watering. But what I want to draw your attention to is forage fish. So in the left panel, that's kind of a historical representation of how we understand food webs in the Salish Sea. If you can make out the bolded groups, functional groups, like seabirds are bolded in the left, salmon, rockfish, forage fish, those represent functional groups that have a disproportionate impact on the structure and function of that food web. So historically, and it's not to say that killer whales weren't important, but that they were not a real structural piece. They weren't really an engineer of the system, but seabirds were, salmon were, rockfish were, forage fish central to almost everything. Look at the arrows coming and going from forage fish. If we then look at the present day, it's not that things have disappeared from that system, but their relative abundance and consequently the relative contributions of those functional groups has changed. So again, we've got forage fish here, but we've lost huge fraction of the historical biomass of forage fish, including Pacific herring in the Salish Sea. So it's no longer bolded. They're still present, but the role that they played ecologically is greatly reduced. Similar to that, seabirds, salmon, and rockfish, they're still here, sometimes in decent numbers, but not relative to the impact and the role that they played in the system historically. And what's happening is we're seeing more opportunistic generalist types of species like jellies, ratfish, Dungeness crabs, taking advantage of the disturbances that are largely human caused. So this has consequences for seabirds. Now, I don't want to leave on a depressing note. I know it's gray, it's rainy, it's dark. And so I do want to say that, yes, there are daunting challenges, but I do believe as a conservation biologist that there are opportunities, but we need to recognize the magnitude of those challenges. So there is additional work that we need to do to track populations. I know I'm a scientist, and so it's always more data. We need more data. We also know enough to make a lot of conservation decisions and priority setting decisions. But understanding better the population trends, are populations stable for focal species? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Of those suite of threats, not all of them are applicable to all species. So which ones are the most important for the species that we're most concerned about? Understanding how they're doing in terms of their reproduction and survival, and then better understanding how they're using marine habitat. Are there areas that are disproportionately important, like those areas that we're beginning to discover for marbled murrelets in the South Sound? Thankfully, again, we are so fortunate that several decades ago, most of our islands, and arguably all of the important seabird islands in Washington state, except for Tatoosh, are federally protected. And Tatoosh is actually very well protected by the Makah Nation. And that includes nearly all of the former and current tufted puffin colonies. There are some really exciting opportunities to do habitat restoration on some of these breeding islands, and we're engaged in some early stages of some of that work on multiple islands. We need to really address the elephant in the room is what's going on with forage fish populations, and what can we do to encourage their recovery. And then finally, it's also about what we decide to do individually and collectively. Yes, there are agencies that are tasked with a lot of this, but it's also what we as individuals, individual residents, the voices that we raise, the communication that we make with our representatives, showing up to talks, participating in conservation activities, all of that makes a difference. And that leads me to just my last comment, which is, and how many of you are already volunteers with the Puget Sound Seabird Survey? Yeah, excellent. Well, so it's transition. So we've been doing this since 2007. I've been heavily involved with the Puget Sound Seabird Survey. It was developed by Seattle Audubon for a number of reasons. Recently, Seattle Audubon decided to sunset it, and I was able to help transition it over to the Puget Sound Bird Observatory, who has thankfully and enthusiastically embraced the opportunity to help guide the program in the future. So I wanted to let folks know that it's a great way to go out and bird for a cause. The data, we've published papers using these data. The data are useful for management, for understanding risks of oil spills and responses to oil spills. There's a number of different ways in which these data can and are being applied. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about it, feel free to contact me, certainly. Toby Ross, who was the science program manager at Seattle Audubon for a number of years, is coordinating it now under the auspices of PSBO. So I wanted to give you the links down there, including his email. So we've started that. We've just had our first 2 months of surveys. Last weekend was the first one, or it was the November one. So please do keep that in mind and let us know if you might be interested. It's a really neat experience and a wonderful community of folks. So with that, I will say thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to try to answer any questions that you might have. Yes. Oh, there we go. I'm just going to grab my water bottle too.
So under the various threats, you listed fisheries bycatch, but do they actually do fishing of the herring population in this area, and is that affecting them?
Not so much. Most of the fisheries bycatch today is still salmon gillnet fishing. And that's been greatly mitigated. So I put that up there again, just kind of to flag it. Thankfully, it's less of an issue than it was even 20 years ago. But it's not fully resolved as an issue. So some species are still, every year there are I would say nearly every year, there are reports of wrecks, frequently of like common murres, where they'll find 100, 150, 200 murres that have washed ashore, somewhere in Puget Sound. And, and for necropsies indicate they've drowned, which means that they were bycatch in fisheries. So it's much better than it was, but we've still got work to do. But there's been some amazing work, and a lot of it led by the fishing communities themselves. They don't want to catch these birds, and when they're given the resources and the opportunities, they're frequently the ones that come up with the best thought out mitigation measures. Yes.
Wow. So two quick questions. There always used to be puffins on the coastal areas, the non-island areas. Point Granville, I think it used to see a fair number there.
Yes.
And I have not seen them there the last couple of visits. Are there any coastal cliff populations?
Not that we're aware of. And we're due to repeat these boat-based surveys. The last ones we did were, I think, 8 years ago. And these are kind of rapid assessments, and we go to all of the historically known islands. And so it's boat-based. We're looking for birds associating with those islands or the headlands down by like Cape Grenville. We haven't seen tufted puffins associated with those headlands in years. We're not there every year, though. So your observations are absolutely consistent with what we suspect, which is, again, that they're disappearing. Where they're hanging on is the places where historically were the largest numbers of birds, which makes sense if you think about why you have large numbers of birds in some places versus others. It's because conditions are more favorable, and that supports larger populations. So where you only have ever seen a few birds, that suggests that conditions there were maybe a bit marginal. There wasn't as much of a buffer as in kind of the core areas.
Okay. And the other quick question was, I work at Discovery Park a lot, and seems to me there are 3 species of puffin. There's tufted puffin, Atlantic puffin, and then there's one mostly in Alaska.
Yes,
horned puffin.
Yes.
So almost every year we're seeing at least one horned puffin.
Yeah.
And it usually comes in July, associated with the rhinoceros auklet movements. Is there any incoming population of that species?
We don't know. We don't know if it's a single well-traveled but really confused horned puffin, or if it's a few birds. But every summer now, for at least, I can't remember when we first saw, and other people see it too, Smith Island. There's regularly a horned puffin doing its best to, it's lovelorn. It flies around. It sits on the surface, it goes into burrows, it comes out of burrows, looking for love in all the wrong places, I guess. It's not been successful. We've seen no evidence of it carrying fish or entering a burrow in such a way that, is basically I'm a breeder and this is my burrow sort of behavior. It's possible that there's a couple of them, or 3 or 4. We've never seen more than 1 at a time out at Smith. But who knows, as things change, species go where they want, and all it takes is a handful of you can tell which species I spend a lot of time working on. All it takes is a handful of horned puffins that decide, that life is better down here, and you could wind up with a small population beginning to establish, which ecologically would be absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Just for scorekeeping, there's 93 of them out there in virtual land who've enjoyed this talk hugely. There are 2 questions only. Come on, you guys. They both ask relatively about auklets and puffins. One is, what's the relative number of auklets and puffins, and the other is, do they compete?
Rhinoceros auklets, at least in Washington waters, absolutely dwarf the tufted puffin population. And historically, that was probably the case too. It's interesting. I've never actually kind of tabulated what an estimate might have been historically for rhinoceros auklets. But if we say there were maybe 25,000 tufted puffins on the outer coast, and at its highest, maybe 1,000 in Salish Sea, just for a frame of reference, our current estimate for protection island for rhinoceros auklets is about 35,000 pairs, breeding pairs. So 70,000 breeders. That's not even counting the non-breeders, just on that island alone. And there's several thousand breeding on Smith Island. On the outer coast, there are islands. Destruction has, I think, I'm trying to remember what that number is. It's 8,000 or so breeding rhinoceros auklets. So historically, they would have always been numerically dominant. Competition is an interesting one. Tufted puffins are larger, but they are pretty timid. And that makes it even harder to work on them. Rhinoceros auklets, and you look at them and you think, okay, if one of these two birds, we want to anthropomorphize for a minute. And you spend a lot of time sitting on islands, watching these birds, and your brain goes in interesting places, but or mine does at least. But if I were to say to you, looking at the plumage of those two birds, which one is the blue collar worker, and which one is the diva? The blue collar worker is the rhinoceros auklet, and it's not that they're not sensitive to disturbance, but they're much more robust to it. And it just seems like year in, year out, it's just like they're the lunch pail gang. They come in and it's like, yep, another breeding season. Okay. And year after year, the prey availability can vary, like on the outer coast, every year the diet looks different. And it's like almost every year, it's like, yep, same old, rhinos just do their thing. Whereas tufted puffins, it's all over the map. And you handle a rhinoceros auklet, or you do something manipulative with them, and you put them back and they're like, screw you. And they go back into their burrow, and then they do their thing and they come back with fish the next night again. Sometimes it feels like with tufted puffins, they see your shadow and they're like, panic, and they bail, which is really not helpful if you're an endangered species that's facing a number of threats. So part of it is, just kind of the behavior, the behavioral, the personality of different species can vary dramatically, and it can have implications for conservation. In this context, they do co-occur. So you have rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins breeding in burrows in places side by side. Rhinoceros auklet burrows are a bit smaller, they're deeper, they're more sinuous. So they're not really appropriate for tufted puffins unless a tufted puffin were to enlarge it. Conversely, a rhinoceros auklet in theory could appropriate a tufted puffin burrow, I guess, and probably add to it, deepen it. But they seem to coexist. It's hard to assess competition directly. So it's not a very satisfying answer, but dietarily, there is some overlap, at least with the data that we're getting now. That doesn't necessarily mean they're really competing. If there's a huge prey base, then food may not particularly be a limiting factor for them. What we have found, though, is using this stable isotope analysis, we can ask questions about like the width of their diet or the breadth of their diet, and using specimens from museums. So we can actually ask questions about historical diet going back 100 years, using specimens from the Burke Museum and the museum down at the University of Puget Sound. And looking at that, neither species, rhinoceros auklets neither rhinoceros auklets nor tufted puffins show a change in where they are trophically or where they are in the food web. So it suggests that they're feeding at the same level. It doesn't mean that the exact species they're feeding on are the same, but where they do differ is in the breadth of their diet. Rhinoceros auklets have a broader diet, which means that they seem to be less specialized, which again, is consistent with the idea, well, they've done really well. They seem to be able to prey switch really easily. I may want herring, but herring aren't as abundant this year. Oh, but there's a bunch of smelt, there's a bunch of this, there's a bunch of that. And at least the data from tufted puffin suggests they're either incapable of prey switching to the same degree or just unwilling to do it for some reason.
One of our away members, whose name will not be mentioned, but she's one of the Willets. She said, rhinoceros auklets are more blue collar.
Yes, they absolutely are. I fully agree. And that's a term I frequently use for, I mean, they're beautiful birds, especially in breeding plumage, but they're not as visually stunning as the other puffins are.
I have a comment, quote, there has been a concerted effort to reduce shoreline armoring to help improve forage fish populations in recognition of their importance to salmon. It's all about salmon. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the state is, it's a daunting task. We've got some really complicated regulations. And what we're really fighting against is a time in which a lot of shoreline was armored prior to us really understanding what the implications of that armoring were ecologically. But the state has made, it's certainly a priority for the Puget Sound Partnership, and a lot of the restoration efforts that they help coordinate and facilitate is to gradually reduce the amount of shoreline armoring. But that's a multi-decadal process, and you definitely get significant pushback from influential lobbying groups, including people who own shoreline shoreline property that they don't want to go into Puget Sound.
Can I ask one more and then I'll get you is there any more information about tufted puffins wintering in the North Pacific and possible interaction with fisheries?
We would love, that is a wonderful question. We have wanted to tag puffins for years to better understand their movements, especially in the non-breeding season. In the breeding season, it would be interesting, but with like Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife does marble Murrelet survey, boat-based surveys, and they survey for everything. So that gives us some sense of the distribution of tufted puffins during the breeding season. But during the non-breeding season, they're gone, they disappear. We are confident that they're out in the North Pacific somewhere, but that's not particularly helpful. That's a pretty large area. And we have tried with very little success to actually put some satellite tags on tufted puffins at the end of the breeding season. We haven't been willing to try it during the breeding season because colleagues up in Alaska have tried to tag birds, and basically what they tracked was where tufted puffins go when they abandon a breeding attempt. So the birds basically say, that was really unpleasant, I am out of here. And they just go out to sea and they abandon their breeding attempt. And that's certainly the last thing we want to risk, here. So we have caught a few birds, but puffins, we knew this because puffin bills are large, they're powerful, and they really hurt. They're also apparently really good at removing satellite tags. So what's that?
But they're just better at that than fishing.
Yeah. It's like, I don't like this on my back. I'm going to keep gnawing at it and yep, it's gone. So, we've lost several $1,000s worth of satellite tags that basically told us they're off of Destruction Island, and we didn't get anything more than that because they tore the tag off. So we don't know. We don't have a good answer to it. There is, and obviously there's a dearth of shipping activity and survey activity in the North Pacific during the winter months for very good reason. So they have been observed out there, but how they're using that vast area, we have no real idea. And we don't have a great way to get at it. Yes.
I was wondering about Atlantic puffin, and because I've seen a lot in the Maritimes, and of course Icelanders were eating them for years.
Mhm.
I wonder if there's any comparison in their status that you know of.
Yes, there is. I mean, Atlantic puffins, their conservation status is variable. So in some parts of their range, they're doing really well. In other parts, they're struggling. Like on a number of breeding islands in the UK, they're seeing some worrying declines, not just in tufted puffins, but in a number of other seabird species. And that's actually prior to the avian flu outbreak, which killed countless breeding seabirds in the UK this over the past year or so. So I don't think, at least I don't know that they're not considered a species of conservation concern throughout their range, but in parts of their range, there is growing concern. I think in the western part of the range, like in the Bay of Fundy and up, off islands, islands off the coast of Maine, and in that region, I think they're stable, as far as I know. If somebody knows differently, please correct me. I'm not as up to date on that, but there's another species where they actually have done some really cool tracking work with Atlantic puffins. They've been able to put transmitters on them and determine some fantastic stuff, really fascinating stuff, which if we were able to generate the same thing for tufted puffins would really help us inform our understanding of wintering habitat use, which again is something important for conservation considerations. But they're just, by personality, they've just got a very different makeup. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I think probably we should give Peter another good hand for that great.
Thank you very much.